Before we begin, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and like the channel, because what you're about to hear, you won't find it anywhere else. This isn't just a story, it's a true testimony of horror from which only one person survived. An isolated place, a heavy night, and sounds that are out of this world. Get ready, turn off the lights, and put on your headphones, because you're about to enter a world from which there's no return. My name is Henry. I'm 25 years old, and I've been living alone for 2 years in a small apartment on the 4th floor of an old building in the city center. The building, with its cracked gray facade, looked as if it had been standing for a century. The interior walls were faded, and the wooden floors creaked with every step, as if groaning under the weight of the years. Yet the low rent was enough to make me forget all these flaws. My daily routine was simple and unchanging. I'd wake up in the morning, put on my suit, and leave for work as a receptionist at a small hotel a few blocks away. I'd return in the evening, exhausted, grab a quick bite, and then sit in front of the computer, watching a movie or jotting down my thoughts in my worn leather notebook. At first, the nights were quiet. The occasional car on the street was the only noise. But a couple of months ago, things started to take a turn for the bizarre. It was a cold Tuesday night, and I was clutching an old book and lying on my battered brown sofa when I distinctly heard slow, heavy footsteps coming from the hallway leading to my apartment. The footsteps were jerky, accompanied by a strange scraping sound, as if someone were dragging their feet along the floor. I lifted my head from the book and listened with all my senses. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. Cautiously, I got up, approached the door, and nervously opened my cat's eye. But the hallway was empty, and the dim lighting flickering overhead only made it more disorienting. I sat back, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. The feeling that someone was stalking me was suffocating me, so I decided to put an end to my curiosity and anxiety. I bought a small surveillance camera and installed it by the door of my apartment, connected to my phone, so I could see any movement in the hallway. The night after I installed the camera, I was deep in a fitful sleep when a notification on my phone woke me up. I reached out with a heavy hand, turned on the live feed, and my blood froze. A tall, unnaturally thin man stood in front of my apartment door, motionless. His head tilted slightly, as if he were staring straight through the door, at me. He didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't move. He stood there for over 2 hours, until he turned around very slowly, as if his body refused to move, and disappeared deep into the dark corridor. In the morning, I couldn't contain my curiosity. I asked my neighbors if they'd noticed a man like this wandering around the building at night. Their response sent shivers down my spine. What man? We didn't see anyone last night. I confidently took out my phone and opened the video for them, but when they watched it, they saw nothing. To them, the corridor was completely empty, with no sign of that man. That's when I realized something, that what I saw on the camera was also seeing me. It was 2 o'clock after midnight, and silence hung over the old building I lived in. It was a heavy silence that was almost suffocating. I was sitting on the couch, trying to finish some work on the computer, but my eyes kept falling asleep, until a faint sound broke the silence. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before, but this time it was different. It sounded like slow, heavy footsteps, as if the person shuffling across the wooden floor of the hallway. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the passing movement of a neighbor. But something about the rhythm, the heaviness, made my heart beat faster. They weren't ordinary footsteps. They were spaced out, even, and each time the foot landed, the wood would groan, a long groan, as if the floor itself was in pain. I slowly turned off the computer and stood approaching the door, my feet moving on tiptoes so as not to make a sound. I put my ear to the cold wood, and the footsteps suddenly stopped, as if the person who made them knew full well I was listening. The silence was so suffocating that I could clearly hear my heartbeat. I swallowed and tried to get back to my place, but before I could settle down on the couch, the footsteps returned. This time they were clearer, closer. I felt as if each step was taking some of my breath away, until I stopped right behind my apartment door. At that moment, curiosity and fear overcame me. I quickly pulled out my phone and activated the camera app I'd installed weeks earlier as a precaution in this bleak neighborhood. Seconds passed before the image of the hallway appeared on the screen, and there, my blood froze. A tall, sickly thin man stood motionless directly in front of the door. His features were blurred in the darkness, but his head was tilted slightly to the right, as if he were listening to what was going on inside the apartment. He didn't move, didn't knock, didn't whisper, just stood there, eerily still. I watched him for several minutes, expecting him to move or leave, but the time hands in the corner of the screen kept moving, while he remained in his position, as if time didn't matter to him. I hung up, trying to think of my next move, when suddenly, a whisper came from behind the door. It was a deep-toned male voice, murmuring words unlike any language I'd ever heard before, like ancient incantations. I approached cautiously, placed my hand on the handle from the inside, and then I felt something that made my heart leap, the warmth of a human palm pressing against the wood from the outside. I took a step back, but the handle began to move, deadly slow, as if those outside were enjoying the moment. I shouted, "Who's there?" Everything stopped. The eerie silence returned, as if nothing had happened. I picked up the phone again, turned on the broadcast. The man was still standing in the same position, his head tilted, as if he hadn't moved in the first place. I felt an overwhelming urge to check with my eyes, so I opened the kitchen window that overlooked the hallway. The place was dark, completely empty, no one. I quickly returned to my phone, turned on the camera. The man had disappeared. The remaining hours of the night passed slowly, and sleep didn't visit my eyes for a single moment. In the morning, I tried to find a rational explanation. I retrieved the video clip from the camera and went to my neighbor, a man in his 50s who lived in the apartment across the street. I showed him the scene and asked if he knew the mysterious man. But he simply stared at the screen in astonishment and said, "Which man? The tape is blank. The corridor is empty." At that moment, I realized something that sent a chill through my body more than ever. What I see, no one else sees. It was nearly 1 a.m., and I was sitting on my bed, my eyes red from lack of sleep. Every night, I tried to convince myself that the voices I was hearing were just illusions, that it was all the result of exhaustion and stress. But that night, the sensation was different. It was heavy, as if the air in the apartment had become slower and heavier, as if time itself was moving at an eerie slow pace. Then the sound began, slow footsteps, 1, 2, spaced apart, as if the person in the hallway was enjoying the long walk, deliberately approaching slowly to prolong my suffering. My heart began to pound in my chest, and without thinking, I reached for the remote control for the surveillance cameras. The small screen lit up, and the hallway was clearly before me, a man standing directly in front of my apartment door. It wasn't a strange face. I'd seen him before. The same disturbing features I couldn't forget, but this time, his head was tilted slightly, as if he was listening to the sounds inside the apartment. My blood froze, and a chill ran down my spine. The air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me, the space around me closing in. Suddenly, on the screen, the man raised his head very slowly, his eyes meeting the camera lens, and then he smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It was a hollow smile, devoid of any warmth, a smile of something merciless. His eyes weren't human eyes, they were completely black, like reflective glass, devoid of any life. I held my breath, watching him slowly reach for the doorknob. The faint metallic sound of his hand rubbing the handle hit my chest like a sudden jolt. I quickly grabbed my phone and called the police, but suddenly, the screen went black in my hand. I tried to turn it on, nervously pressing the buttons, to no avail. I turned my gaze back to the camera. The door was empty. The man had disappeared. But strangely, I didn't hear any footsteps that would indicate his departure. The corridor was empty, except for a black shadow creeping up the wall, like the shadow of a person standing just outside my field of vision. Then came the knocking, 3 times, steady, slow, like the rhythm of a sick heart. There was no urgency, just a quiet threat, a message saying, "I'm here." I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the bottom of the door, until I saw something that made my throat go dry. From the narrow gap beneath, thick black smoke began to seep out, creeping along the floor as if it had a life of its own. I felt as if the floor was breathing. The room suddenly cooled, and I felt as if someone was emptying my soul from my body. Then the whispers began. They came from everywhere, surrounding me from the walls, the ceiling, and even the floor. Unintelligible words, but they were directed at me alone, as if they were speaking my name. The voice was very close to my ear, even though I was alone. Suddenly, the hall light began to flicker irregularly, and with each flicker, I saw a tall shadow standing in the center of the room. The shadow didn't move with the light, it was independent of the laws of space and time. He was taller than any human I'd ever seen, and his head almost touched the ceiling. I mustered my tattered courage and brought the chair over and placed it in front of the door, a desperate attempt to prevent any entry. But before I could even take a step away, I felt a cold, icy hand rest on the back of my shoulder. I froze. I didn't dare turn around. But that hand began to press down slowly, until I felt my shoulder bones groan under its fork. I ran to the office where the security camera monitor was. I pressed the play button, waited for the image to appear, and there he was, the same man I'd seen before. He stood in front of my apartment door, his head tilted slightly to the right, a fixed, terrifying smile plastered on his face. But this time, it wasn't normal. His features were blurred, as if a mist had covered his face, yet I felt as if he was looking directly at me, into my eyes, not the camera. What was even more terrifying was that his body was completely still, but his fingers moved slowly in the air, as if drawing symbols or writing invisible words. Then suddenly, the screen went dark, and the apartment was plunged into total darkness. Even the sound of the devices disappeared, leaving only the sound of my gasping breaths and the pounding of my heart. Then I heard slow footsteps moving away from the door. Step, step, but they didn't disappear completely, instead stopping abruptly, as if the person was still standing somewhere very close. I retreated to my room and locked the door. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, listening for any movement. It wasn't long before another sound began, a soft scraping coming from under the bed. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a mouse or the sound of wood, but gradually the scraping turned into the sound of fingernails scraping against wood, slowly, insistently, as if it knew I was listening. I bent down a little and peered under the bed. It was pitch black, but something was moving. Slowly, its features began to emerge, a distorted face, its skin cracked and dry, and large, lidless eyes staring at me fixedly, as if they never blinked. I backed away quickly and hit the wall, but the face didn't disappear. Instead, it began to smile, a wide smile revealing rows of long, sharp teeth, and I heard its voice again, this time closer, as if it were directly in my ear. "I told you. Open the door." I could no longer sleep as I had before. I would wake up to any sound, no matter how faint, as if my nerves were stretched to their limits, like a string about to snap. That night, I was lying in bed, staring at the reflection of the streetlights on the ceiling. The lights moved slowly, as if they were being twisted by a cold wind outside. I tried to fall asleep, but suddenly, a familiar sound pierced my ears, the creaking of a door. It wasn't my apartment door, but the outside door of the building. It opened slowly, and with every centimeter it moved, a faint metallic chime sounded like the groan of a sick person. I held my breath, straining my ears. Then the next sound began, very slow footsteps, as if someone were walking barefoot on the cold tiles, each step creating a soft crackle in my ears. The footsteps climbed the stairs, floor by floor, and I followed them in my mind as if counting them. They drew near, until they reached my floor. And then, I stopped completely. Unable to bear the combined curiosity and fear, I cautiously got up. I walked over to the door and opened it slightly, just enough to look out into the corridor. The corridor was completely empty, but something else had changed. The air was unnaturally cold, to the point that my breath appeared before me as white vapor. I went back inside and locked the door securely. I tried to tell myself that it was just an illusion caused by exhaustion, that I was imagining things that didn't exist. But my heart didn't believe my mind. Then, without warning, all the lights in the apartment went out in an instant. The darkness was so stifling, so deep, I could no longer see my hand in front of my face. I reached for the phone to turn on its flashlight, but before I could touch it, I heard a whisper, right behind my ear. "Give me back what I took." I jumped away, my chest nearly exploding from the force of my pulse. There was no one there, but a blast of cold air penetrated my neck, as if someone's breath had just touched my skin. I backed away until I was against the wall, trying to muster my courage. But something strange began to happen. I felt the room shift, the spaces in it no longer the same, as if I were somewhere else. The furniture was no longer in its places, and the floor seemed to tilt slightly beneath my feet. Suddenly, lightning flashed for a moment, revealing a scene I will never forget. He was standing in front of the apartment door. His head was tilted to one side, his eyes completely black, his mouth slit like a deep gash extending all the way to his ear, and his long, pointed teeth glinted in the flash of light. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He was just smiling, that smile that made my heart stop. Then darkness fell again. Seconds later, I heard the creaking again. The apartment door itself began to open very slowly, but this time there was no human hand holding the handle. The door moved on its own, as if an invisible force was beckoning it to enter. At that moment, I realized one thing, that whatever came tonight would not leave before it got what it came for. I could no longer distinguish between night and day. Time had become a series of heavy moments, intertwined until I lost all sense of them. The walls of the apartment began to close in on me like a living, breathing creature, waiting for the right moment to close in and swallow me up. I rarely left my place, as if the world outside the door had become a black, silent void, staring at me from afar. But that night was different. I was sitting on the floor, my back against the cold wall in the corner of the living room, watching the door as I did every night. The clock's hands pointed to 2 a.m. The air in the room was still, even the distant sounds of cars I used to hear had disappeared, as if the entire city had chosen to hold its breath. Suddenly, the camera mounted above the door shook slightly, but it was clear, not like a movement in the wind or a technical glitch, but more like a deliberate touch. The screen in front of me began to display a strange blur, with white and black lines intertwining, then the image cut off for a moment before resuming. And he returned with it. But this time, he wasn't standing far away as before. He was bent over, his face completely glued to the camera lens, so much so that his left eye alone almost filled the screen. That eye, unnaturally wide open, staring directly into the apartment, at where I was sitting. I felt a sudden chill run through my veins, as if the blood had decided to stop. I couldn't move, until my throat went dry. Then, the door began to shake slowly. At first, the shaking was subtle, but it quickly became more pronounced, as if someone was testing its strength, or its willingness to surrender. The metallic sound of the friction was faint, but it pierced my ear directly. Between the shakes, I could hear something else, breathing. Heavy, deep, and slightly trembling, as if it was coming from a chest filled with anger or hatred. I slowly reached for the doorknob, not thinking why I was doing it, perhaps because a part of me wanted to be sure, or wanted to end this game. But before I touched the handle, I heard my name. It wasn't an ordinary call, but a whisper, as if two people were speaking at once, a deep male voice and a cracked female voice, eerily overlapping, as if they were struggling to pronounce it. I backed away quickly until I hit the wall. I turned to the screen, no movement. The door stopped shaking. Silence suddenly returned, a silence so heavy I felt it pressing against my chest. For a moment, I thought it was over. But when I happened to look toward the window, I saw him. Standing on the balcony of the apartment opposite. Same face, same distorted features, but this time, there was a smile. Slow, growing wider, until his features were torn apart into a shape that couldn't be human. His teeth were long, misaligned, like shards of glass. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. At that moment, all the lights went out, even the camera screen went into complete darkness. All that remained was that voice, the same double whisper, but now closer, as if it were inside the room. No one will see you, but me. I no longer knew whether to open or close my eyes, because the darkness had become one, but I felt a cold, dry hand slowly touching my face. I could no longer distinguish night from day. All hours became the same, and time was just a black void expanding around me. A few days were enough to erase the sense of safety from me, making me feel like a prisoner in a place that grew narrower every day. That thing, or the man, or what remained of him, drew closer each time, as if the distance between us was being slowly and deliberately erased. That very night, the atmosphere was so stifling that breathing became difficult. The rain pounded violently against the windowpane, and the wind whistled in my ears like the groans of the dead whispering in the dark. I sat in the middle of the living room, alone, watching the security screen as usual. This screen became my only window to the world, an eye with which I could peer into the danger that awaited beyond the door. It was nearly 2 a.m. when he appeared, the same gaunt body, the same distorted features I had seen before, but this time he was different. He didn't stand still as usual, but rather, very slowly, raised his head toward the camera. His eyes, no, they weren't eyes, they were two bottomless black holes, and yet I was certain he was looking directly at me, penetrating the camera glass and burying his gaze deep inside me. Then, he smiled. But it wasn't a human smile. It was a cruel facial disfigurement, the skin around his mouth ripped away until rotten, yellow teeth were revealed. He slowly raised his hand and pointed toward my apartment door, as if asking me to come closer, or to open up. I didn't realize the signal until I heard the knocking. Heavy, recurring, violent knocking, as if someone were trying to break the door down with their fists. I jumped up, grabbed a metal stick from the kitchen, and stood watching the door with wide eyes. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I took a step closer, then another. I put my ear to the door. I didn't hear anything, but I felt a strange warmth seeping in from the other side, as if something was breathing very slowly, heavy, ragged, burning breaths. Then, without warning, the door shook so violently that I felt as if the hinges would be ripped out of place. My blood froze, and I recoiled when I heard the sound. It was a whisper at first, but it wasn't just any whisper. It was two voices at once, a deep male voice and a woman's cracked voice, mingling in a suspiciously raspy way. "Give her back, give her back, give her back." The words repeated themselves, each repetition making them louder and sharper, until they became an ear-piercing scream. I didn't understand what he meant, but a guttural feeling told me it was about the woman who was murdered here before I lived in this apartment. And suddenly, everything went silent. I began to move slowly toward the bedroom, but as soon as I turned my back, I heard the creak of the door. It was opening, of its own accord. I turned quickly, and it was half open, with the cold air seeping in as if something invisible had just entered. And then, I saw it. He was inside the apartment, standing in the corner of the hall, his body leaning forward, his head turned at an impossible angle, and his eyes, or rather, their emptiness, fixated on me. I couldn't control myself, so I raised my iron rod and struck him with all my might, but the blow passed through as if it had penetrated thick smoke. The next moment, I felt a powerful blow to my chest that knocked me to the ground. When I opened my eyes, he was directly above me, his long hand on my neck, his slender fingers digging into my skin until I felt my very soul being sucked out. My breathing became ragged, and his face drew closer to mine until I smelled a suffocating stench of decay, the stench of ancient death. Then he whispered in his two voices, "You won't get out, unless you bring her to me." And in a flash, he was gone. He left me panting on the floor, feeling my still aching neck, my eyes raking the empty hall, waiting for the moment he would return, because I knew he would. I had no idea that this night would be the last of my life, or at least, the last I would experience as a human being. My breathing was heavy, as if I were breathing through an iron lung, and my body was so heavy with fear that I felt the ground pulling me down. I could hear his footsteps in the corridor before he appeared, that familiar sound that had begun to seep into my dreams and tear them apart, clacking, clacking. Each step drew closer, like a finger pressing against an open wound. I didn't hide this time. I don't know if it was bravery or slow suicide, but I decided to confront him. I held the kitchen knife with both hands, my fist trembling, but my eyes fixed on the door, watching his shadow creep through the small opening. It was 3 in the morning, and the darkness left no room for hope. Even the streetlight that had been filtering in through the window suddenly went out, as if the night itself had decided to grant us a private confrontation, without witnesses, without escape. The doorknob began to move slowly, metallic sounds permeating it like the groan of iron. A long creaking sound broke the silence, and I saw him. His face. It wasn't a human face. His skin was gray and cracked, like the earth after a long drought. His eyes were sunken in 2 black holes, and his mouth was slit like an old wound that had never healed. But what froze my blood was that he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the middle of the dark corridor, stood a woman, half of her face burned, the other half stretched out in a cold, emotionless smile. Her eyes were wide, staring at me as if searching for a place to sow terror. Her hands were covered in blood, and drops of it slowly fell to the ground, forming small circles that shimmered in the dim light. They made no sound as they advanced toward me, as if the ground didn't dare to touch their feet. I took a deep breath, raised the knife, and tried to stab the man, but his body was cold and hard as iron, as if I had tried to cut through a piece of stone. In a flash, he grabbed my wrist, and I felt my bones crack beneath his icy grip. The pain was so intense that I ignored the woman's close proximity to my face. Her scent was a mixture of burnt flesh and old blood, and her voice, like the scraping of nails on glass, as she whispered close to my ear. "Now you will join us." The next moment, I felt something hot and sticky trickle down my neck. It wasn't ordinary blood, it was heavier, slower, as if it was pulling something deeper with it, my very soul. The walls around me began to change, their colors faded to gray, family photos fell from their places as if they didn't want to bear witness to what was happening, and the air became saturated with the scent of death until I felt like I was breathing the cold dust of a cemetery. I fell to the ground, my body trembling, searching for air that wouldn't come. Suddenly, I saw myself. Yes, I was looking at my body lying in the corner of the room, my face pale, dead, and motionless. The man stood by the door, the woman beside him, both smiling that smile unbecoming of the living. Then came the sound. A heavy knock on the door. 3 slow knocks, as if the person outside knew exactly what awaited him. The man turned, opened the door slowly, and the person entering was a stranger, perhaps a new neighbor or a victim whose fate had yet to be determined. He turned to me, and at that moment, I realized the terrifying truth. It was me now, standing by the door, looking in, smiling as they had smiled at me. Before we begin, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and like the channel, because what you're about to hear, you won't find it anywhere else. This isn't just a story, it's a true testimony of horror from which only one person survived. An isolated place, a heavy night, and sounds that are out of this world. Get ready, turn off the lights, and put on your headphones, because you're about to enter a world from which there's no return.